Welcome. Last time I did a video about the use and application of the word misinformation in the pandemic, and the subsequent censorship on mainstream and social media of data or views that differed from the mainstream narrative and response to COVID-19. This applied to not only the lay public, but most disturbingly, to highly qualified doctors and scientists. And the main tenor of that video was to reflect how this response was both at odds with democracy and the right to free speech. Also, that it was totally contrary and inexplicable in the face of long-established and accepted principles of democracy, science, and good medical practice, was quite extraordinary in nature, and should, I believe, deeply concern us all. Today I want to look at another word that became widespread and unfortunately increasingly weaponized as the main rollout of the Covid Inoculation took place, and that's the word anti-vaxxer. In the Merriam-Webster dictionary, its most recent definition of this word is a person who opposes the use of some or all vaccines, regulations mandating vaccination, or usually both. It began to be used against individuals who even questioned, let alone elected not to have the COVID jab, in an increasingly personal, accusatory and dismissive vein, and came to be directed at them almost like a swear word or a slingshot. This style and kind of response stands directly at odds with our respect and acceptance of the prior established right of each one of us to have bodily autonomy and the freedom to decide what medical products we put in our body through informed consent. This value and right is entrenched in our democracy, and in particular in the laws and ethics of medicine. Yet the reference, reminder and championing of it began to diminish in face of the call by the government and medical authorities that inoculation with the COVID jab was increasingly the recommended answer for everybody. So what caused that to happen? Well, in one way of looking at it, two important parts of human experience that normally coexist fairly comfortably alongside together were allowed to move into a more oppositional relationship with each other that over time became increasingly tense and polarized. This constellated around the principle of bodily autonomy and the individual right to choose what medical products we put in our bodies, and that principle being yielded and made subservient to the aims of the larger group in this instance. In other words, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the one. In addition, these values and principles were able to become conflicted in the presence of a strong message and preference for one option by the government, medical authorities and mainstream institutions, namely for us all to get the jab. This was able to happen for a number of reasons. One extremely important ingredient was that large numbers of the population explicitly trusted all that they were told, including that the government was following the science, that the jab fulfilled the criteria of a vaccine, and that it was safe and effective. None of which, as it turned out, has subsequently been demonstrated, if you do the research, to hold out to any meaningful objective scrutiny. The population also had a well-established belief, or deep belief and identification with our mainstream medical system of allopathic medicine and pharmaceutical products, which champion the jab as the way out of COVID. Therefore, most of the public had no desire or indeed saw any need to question the mainstream narrative of the orthodoxy or do further research themselves on their own. In my view, always a dangerous thing when that happens, because questioning and independent research is one of the key checks and balances that serves to maintain democracy and also helps us all find the best outcome. Furthermore, the absence of questioning about what we were told from many stakeholders also served a strong emotional and psychological imperative which we humans need, and that's namely our desire to feel safe. The need to feel safe and secure is one of our strongest biological imperatives. Feeling fear and being frightened has a constructive purpose for us as human beings in many situations, but we don't like feeling that way for any length of time if you're anything like myself, and we'll look to go back to feeling secure typically as soon as we can. In other words, if something helps you feel less frightened, it's a natural human tendency to sort of grab onto that in order to re-establish security, or hold on to that and not challenge and ask questions, contributed to and served that need in many people. So let's now delve a little more into how these two values and principles of the individual approach and the collective approach came into conflict. It would be true to say that in many respects they're both felt by all of us in one situation or another. In other words, no one human being always and only acts in an individualistic way, and no one human being always and only acts solely to the benefit of the collective. And although it might not look like it, they both actually have the same need and end goal, which is our need to feel safe. They just go about it in different ways that look as though they're at odds with each other. And being natural parts of human experience, each has a unique contribution to society and acts to create a balance that's actually beneficial to us all. However, if you imbalance that relationship by denigrating and dismissing one part, we lay ourselves open to escalating into far more unsavoury and darker parts of human nature. And we started to see the beginnings of this happening in the gaslighting and scapegoating of individuals who just had questions or elected not to have the jab. Indeed, in the extreme end, some people were unfortunately wishing them ill health or even death, and were in favour of them being locked up or perhaps even being forcibly jabbed, let alone being mandated to have it because of their job. Okay, so early in this video, in referring to these two values and principles of right to individual bodily autonomy and prioritising the needs of the group, I used the phrase, "we're allowed to move into an oppositional relationship with each other." The key words being, "were allowed to." And what I mean by that is that the government, politicians and mainstream institutions that protect our democracy all stood by and were directly responsible for letting a narrative form and grow, or in certain cases actively fed it themselves, where the term anti-vaxxer increasingly became used in a biased, intimidatory and weaponized fashion against a significant portion of their population. For example, the then Prime Minister Boris Johnson was quoted as saying something like during the pandemic, "There's all these anti-vaxxers now, they're nuts, they're nuts." Not only that, but very few of those who were in positions of leadership reminded us of our crucial right to bodily autonomy and their commitment to that, presumably either because it didn't occur to them, they chose to ignore it, or it might dilute their objective of us all getting jabbed. So before we get to a conclusion, let's briefly examine what many on the side of everybody getting the jab feel, and see is the key ethical argument and position that trumps the individual right to exercise bodily autonomy. And it goes something like this. Human beings have an implicit social contract with each other where we all agree to individually do things that directly contribute and look after the safety of us all. When called upon and needed, this may or should supersede our individual choices and preferences. Well, that definitely has something important to say and states a truth about our need to rely on cooperation with each other for our mutual benefit. It does come with certain highly important precepts. And the key one in the situation of the COVID jab that we were categorically promised was that it was safe. While that claim was made, it could not possibly be justified on the basis that it implies that at the time that the claim was made or is being made, it was known for sure that the Covid inoculation did not have any long-term impacts worth knowing about. Yet it hadn't been around long enough for that claim of safety to have had the necessary amount of time, which normally needs several years, to be substantiated and justified. Therefore, it was a lie. This point alone highlights that the assumption that we should just trust absolutely and without question the word of our institutions is regrettably and unfortunately just not borne out by fact. For example, if you did a small amount of research, you would soon see that Big Pharma has way more influence on medicine and our mainstream institutions than most of us either would know about or would be likely to think is healthy. For we don't live in a world where we can rule out the existence of perverse incentives that weight objectives in a certain direction. Hence, a key benefit and purpose that accompanies the right to bodily autonomy, and indeed to question and challenge. So therefore we need to allow and value that different views, while they may seem incoherent or irrational to our own view, or perhaps appear to threaten our own sense of safety, are not shunned or demonized out of hand, for they actually serve a highly useful purpose. They allow us to test where we and others are coming from, and what they have put in place, why they've done it, and whether it's working for all our benefits. So, what's the overall point and conclusion that I'm arriving at? It's this, that I don't think that the allowance or encouragement by our institutions of the increasingly dismissive use of the term anti-vaxxer is either okay or appropriate in a society that claims to be a democracy and is acting from a place of love and beneficence. While doubtless it would claim to act from the worthy intention of protecting the majority, it actually does something dark in the name of the light that directly and indirectly, if unchecked, destabilizes the security of certain individuals and the society it is saying it is seeking to protect. It actually smacks of acting from fear and the need to control through instilling fear and manipulating the population's group instinct to feel safe in a manner that actually decreases the safety initially of certain individuals, but ultimately everybody's and the whole of society. This responsibility doesn't just rest with politicians and the mainstream institutions that were in charge, for some of us public have joined in too, and it's helpful for us and them to share ownership of our and their own actions. However, our leaders, because of their role and their position, do have a predominant clear duty and responsibility not only to not feed it themselves, but to remind us all of another equally vital and important value that coexists alongside our need to act in the interests of the whole. Namely, the freedom of the individual to have the right of choice. For to balance an earlier reference in this video, that the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the one, this time in reverse, the needs of the one outweigh the needs of the many. In reality, they coexist together, and are mutually beneficial, and we mustn't get drawn into forgetting or demonizing either of them through fear if we are to find and remain in the light. Thank you for listening, and do please press the button to be let known about future videos, as well as if you like this material or think it's helpful for friends, family, or others to know about, please to let them know. Thank you, and please look forward to joining me again.